So today I'm going to be talking about the threats to human rights and religious freedom from religious nationalism. I'm going to focus on the United States, which has a unique combination of both a constitutional promise of religious freedom alongside a historical institutional commitment to Christian privilege, which has always limited the possibilities of religious and other forms of freedom. So Christian nationalism is one of many instances of religious nationalism, each functioning in some similar ways with some differences. Such as with Hindu nationalism in India or Catholic nationalism in Poland. Often, religious nationalism mobilizes the state to allow for both privileging certain religions and allowing for discrimination. So in the United States, one of the founding constitutional principles we have inscribed in the words of the First Amendment is freedom of religion. Yet Christian nationalism, since the inception of the country, has both limited these protections and interpreted them as a license to discriminate, often to reinforce and justify white supremacy. So today I'm going to cover briefly 3 examples where Christian nationalism has been used to justify discrimination. So the first and really egregious example involves the criminalization of Native American religions. So despite the First Amendment constitutional protections for religious freedom, beginning in the early 19th century, the United States, as part of its genocidal campaigns against First Nations peoples, granted a number of Protestant denominations the rights to implement Christian education across the United States, often through enforcing, basically criminalizing Native American languages and traditions. This was formalized in 1883 when the Department of Interior criminalized Indian dances and ceremonies with threats of imprisonment and food rations for anyone caught practicing traditional ceremonies. This was not reversed until 1978, nearly a century later. So many issues continue around Native American religious freedom, particularly around sacred sites. Since many Native religious practices celebrate natural places and not buildings, they're often denied protections of these spaces. But the final 2 examples I'm going to talk about in terms of Christian nationalism are more recent. And the first is about the way that Christian nationalism has been used to really limit the civil rights of people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. So beginning in the 1970s, when LGBT groups started to advocate for rights and demanding that they should deserve the same civil rights as other Americans, an organized religious right movement formed, actively seeking to deny those extensions of rights. For over 40 years, white evangelicals led both local and national campaigns to limit civil rights of sexual minorities through advocating a privileged relationship to the state. And we're incredibly successful at limiting these rights up through the last decade. Anti-sodomy laws were only struck down in 2013 on the federal level, at which point 10 states still had anti-sodomy laws on the books. And it was only this summer when the Supreme Court extended civil rights protections based on sexual orientation, so that finally people cannot be fired or denied housing because of their perceived sexual identity or gender status. So Christian nationalists ensured until very recently that the civil rights of sexual minorities were limited. And today, these rights are not completely set in stone, depending on the kind of how the Supreme Court may reshape them. But now this Christian nationalist movement is mobilizing to use religious freedom laws to continue to give legal recourse for discrimination based on sexual identity and gender identity. This is really dangerous in that studies have shown that LGBTQ youth find that perceptions of discrimination based on sexual orientation leads to increased depressive symptoms, risk of self-harm, and suicidal ideation compared to their heterosexual and cisgender peers. And it's also discriminatory policies are associated with increases in hate crimes and other forms of discrimination. The last example actually goes hand in hand with Dr. Corey's presentation, and that's looking at anti-Islamic racism and the limitations on religious freedom for Muslims in the United States. Particularly since 9/11, anti-Islamic racism has animated much of conservative culture in the US, particularly in white evangelicalism, where Christian nationalists have actually been mobilizing an argument that Islam itself is not a religion, but a political ideology, which has been kind of helped to bolster other extreme forms of discrimination, such as the Muslim ban implemented in 2017, which was upheld by the Supreme Court, despite it following Trump's promise of a, quote, total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. There's also, dozens of examples across the country of municipalities which have denied permits for the construction of mosques. So in New Jersey, Tennessee, Virginia, Connecticut, Illinois, and a number of other places, mosque permits have been denied for a variety of really egregious reasons. So in some cases, there were questions about whether or not there would be animal sacrifices involved in the mosque a lot in these permit denials, or comments about, this kind of stereotype of Islamic gender politics as an excuse for why mosque permits were denied. And just as with LGBTQ rights, there's a correlation between institutional discrimination and other negative effects. So that in the United States, nearly every state has had instances, sometimes dozens of instances of anti-mosque activity, everything from arson to spray paint to broken windows. So in closing, the very possibility of religious freedom in the United States will require an end to Christian nationalism and its privileged relationship to the state. Thank you.